Hemant Mehta is the editor of friendlyatheist.com and the author of I Sold My Soul on eBay and the Young Atheist Survival Guide. He has appeared on Fox News and CNN and previously served as the chair of the SSA Board of Directors. When he's not writing, Hemant is a national board-certified high school math teacher in the suburbs of Chicago. Please welcome friendly atheist Hemant Mehta. And a fantastic MC.
I'll steal this. Michael's totally right. You want to take away like one thing from each speaker you see. I got two things. Anyone want to guess what they are?
Fact check.
Thank you. I don't know how you did that. So I'm going to try to go through this as quickly as possible because there's not a lot of time. But those are the two things I want you to do. How many of you are bloggers? Just out of curiosity. A good chunk of you. How many of you write for your group's website or go on Twitter and post stuff about atheism and go on Facebook and post stuff on atheism? Keep your hands raised, all of you. That's a good chunk of you. So this applies to almost everyone in here. So a quick story. If any of you listen to This American Life, this weekend they're celebrating their 500th episode. Huge milestone for them. Last year, like back in January of 2012, they aired this amazing episode about this guy. It's this guy's story. His name is Mike Daisey. He's an Apple fanboy, loves the company, and long story short, he wanted to know how Apple makes its products. So we told this hour-long, beautiful story about how he went to like Shenzhen, China, where they have the factory where they make these products. And he's like, yeah, I went there and my translator went with me because she helped me out. And we met these kids outside the factory and they were working there. And they were like 14 years old and 13 and 12. And it's like, oh my God, that's horrible. And then he's saying, yeah, and then I met secretly with workers who were secretly trying to unionize because they weren't allowed to do that. So we went to like a Starbucks in China and we met there under the cover of everyone else. Tells the story about the horrible conditions that are there. When that story aired, it was This American Life's most downloaded episode ever. And it got Apple on the fence too, because they had to either defend their practice or change it. And they were actually forced to change their practices, which is a good thing. But a couple months later, This American Life put out a statement that said, hey, you know how we aired that episode about Apple? Turns out Mike Daisey lied about a lot of things in his thing. Like, for example, we don't have any evidence that kids that young actually work there. We asked him if we can get in touch with this translator. He said, I don't know where she is. I don't have any contact information. I lost touch with her. I don't know what her deal is. And someone even told This American Life, like, there's no way people unionized in Starbucks because they make no money in these factories and Starbucks isn't free. Like, there's no way they would ever meet there. So they did the fact-checking finally, and they realized that he had exaggerated or basically told fabrications throughout the story. All of a sudden, This American Life's credibility might be shot. So what did they do? They aired a follow-up episode where they actually brought back Mike Daisey and they questioned him, like, why did you lie to us? And his answer for a lot of these questions was just silence, as he thought about, like, how do I respond to this? And he would give answers, he would try to give answers, but This American Life aired the silence. They didn't edit it down or anything. It was just like, lots of the episode is like 15, 20-second spans of silence. So awkward and amazing. And what was amazing is they even had the guy who really did the fact-checking and really called him out on this. He's like, you know the translator he can't get in touch with? Yeah, I searched for the city he went to and translator on Google. First person who turned up was this guy's translator. So I talked to her and he's like, did you meet kids working at the factory? She's like, no. And so basically they called this guy out. And guess what? That became their most downloaded episode ever. So even better. But here's the whole point. One of the reasons we are able to pick apart religion is because we say they don't do a good job of handling the evidence. They deny the evidence, they deny reality, and we can call you out on it and we're really good at it. And we should keep doing that. That's the one thing we have going for us, that reality seems to align with our worldview, right? So, here's the problem. There's a lot of times when we do things that are just as bad, where our facts don't check out, and if we lose that, we're screwed. So we gotta do our own fact-checking. So this is the first stuff we gotta talk about. So I'm gonna give you, really quick story too. I'm writing an article, hopefully for a magazine, I don't know. But I asked a writer friend of mine, I'm like, hey, if I'm writing this thing, how should I document people I interview? Like, when I hand the editor, like, my rough draft or something, how should I hand them whatever my facts were? Like, if I interview someone, should I record it and email them an MP3? What should I do? She laughed at me. And then she's like, you think people are going to fact check you? No one's going to fact check you. You just got to be right. Otherwise, you know, it's just on you. No one fact check. There's like one magazine I know that does fact checking. No one else calls you out on it. Which is why you see like Newsweek magazine saying like, heaven's for real and stuff like that. Because no one's doing that anymore. So, let's talk about some things I've seen. This is a billboard that a group called the Backyard Skeptics in California put up sometime in 2011. It's Thomas Jefferson, and he's saying, I do not find in Christianity one redeeming feature. It is founded on fables and mythology. Which, by the way, that is an awesome statement that Thomas Jefferson never, ever said. And in fact, what happened is a reporter contacted Monticello, I believe, like Thomas Jefferson's place, and the person who responded back, or on their website, they've actually talked about this quotation because it gets attributed to him a lot. And they said, you know, a lot of people attribute it from a letter from Thomas Jefferson to a Dr. Wood, but he never wrote to anyone called Dr. Wood. And this whole thing about there's no one redeeming feature in Christianity, Todd Stiefel yesterday told you like about the Jefferson Bible where he clipped out the miracles but kept everything else. Everything else is the stuff Thomas Jefferson found redeeming. So right there, like, no, there is stuff he found redeeming. It wasn't the miracles, but it was other stuff. So what happens when they put up that billboard? All of a sudden it's like, well, if atheists can't get it right, how much other stuff are they not telling us the truth about? Here's another one, and I love American Atheists. They put up this billboard, this is back in March, and they put up a series of billboards with like politicians basically trying to merge church and state. And this is the one that with Sarah Palin, and it says, we should create law based on the God of the Bible. Which, it's like, that does sound like something Sarah Palin would say. But it turns out the actual quotation is, she said, is go back to what our founders and our founding documents meant. They're quite clear that we would create law based on the God of the Bible and the Ten Commandments. The point being, technically, I would argue that those two things mean the same thing. But if you're putting stuff in quotation marks, she better have said it. And she didn't actually say that. And here's where it got embarrassing. I posted this on my website too, and I'm like, oh, look at that billboard campaign. CNN, a reporter from CNN's like, that quotation's not accurate. And that was a little part of his article about these billboards, that American Atheists is putting up these billboards about quotations from politicians, but here's one of the ones that's probably the most controversial, and it wasn't actually what Sarah Palin said. I hate to cede any ground to Sarah Palin. And to their credit, American Atheists replaced this billboard with more accurate ones that were actually quoting people. Sadly, they did not have any lack of quotations to use. That's the thing. Has anyone ever heard the story of what George H.W. Bush ever said about atheists? Yeah. Yell it out. What did he say?
They're not patriots.
We should not be considered citizens. We should not be considered patriots. In fact, the way I've heard it is, no, I don't know that atheists should be considered as citizens, nor should they be considered patriots. So George W. Bush's father, President Bush, the first said that, and I've heard that repeated so many times. Like, look at what this guy said about atheists. What a horrible thing to say, that we're unpatriotic. Where did this quotation come from? It came from one guy who happens to be an atheist who said, I interviewed George Bush and he said this. No, I don't have a recording of him saying this. You would think when a president says something even remotely controversial, like 37 people would have gotten this on video and recording. There is no evidence that he ever said this. So basically we're taking one guy at his word that he said this. I'm not saying it didn't happen, but I'm saying, like, if a Christian told us this happened, we would laugh it off. We should be better about fact-checking our own stuff that we start spreading. While we're on the same page, how many atheists are in prison? What percentage of prisoners are atheists?
Like 1%.
I heard it there. 0.2 is the number I've heard. Prisoners, if you ask prisoners, what's your religious belief? the number of prisoners, the percentage of prisoners who claim to be atheists, 0.2. We're like 20%, 30% of the population or something, are nuns, but 0.2% of the prison population. Where does that number come from? Comes from one site, which is adherence.com. How many of you go to adherence.com? Nobody. And basically, it says that someone contacted the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and they spoke to this woman, Denise, who, by the way, doesn't work there. And this is the report she gives them, like, oh, atheists make up 0.209% of prisoners. Hey, cool, then we should be able to verify that through, like, a government website or something, right? No, you can't do it, because that data isn't anywhere at the Federal Bureau of Prisons website. It doesn't exist, except on this site and any place linking to this site. And I'm not saying atheists aren't 0.2% of the population, but we ought to be able to back that up. By the way, I've contacted the Federal Bureau of Prisons and they haven't written back to me yet. Because I want to know what the number is. Even if it's like 10%, I think we could get away with saying it's still like, it's not proportional to the population. There's something we're doing right. But this has no actual verification that we should be going off of. It's just one person citing it, and then it gets published everywhere. And I've seen this in like academic studies, like, why are atheists so untrustworthy? It's weird because we're not even in prison. It's like, no, you can't really say that. And they actually linked to this page on the internet. Like, don't do that. That's not cool. So that's number one. We have to fact check our own information, and we got to find some credible sources for stuff. And believe me, I'm not saying I do it better or anything like that, because I'm sure if you go to my website, you will find a ton of stuff. I hope not, but you might. That is inaccurate, but I'm just saying we ought to do a better job if we're going to call other people out on it. So that's number one. Fact check, especially when it comes to our own stuff. Here's the second thing we want to do. Follow up on stories, because this is something the media doesn't do. The media tends to like atheists, and the reason is journalists love controversy, and what's more controversial than atheists? Period. Like nothing. If you exist, they want to write a story about you. And we've seen that all over the place. How many of you have had an article written about your organization? And I would guess, for the most part, those stories were just like, check out this club, it's at the school. There's nothing more to the story than this club meets every week and they're atheists. But the thing is, most of these journalists, and they have to do this, but they can't follow up on all of these stories, and sometimes getting more information on what the journalists report is way more fascinating than anything else we could do. That's why I respect so much what This American Life did with the Mike Daisey story. They could have just said, we retract that episode and add a lot of false information, but they didn't. They spent another week talking about why those mistakes went through, what they are doing to make sure it never happens again. They interviewed Mike Daisey again to make sure, they called him out publicly on it, because they wanted to make sure they followed up on that story and regained the trust of their listeners. So when I was writing this book, Young Atheist Survival Guide, that's one of the things I was able to do, which is, let me look at all the stories I've written in the past several years about high school atheists, or even younger, and let's see how they're doing. And one of the articles one of the people I talked about was this woman, Chelsea Stanton. And what she did is, as a senior in high school a couple years ago, she said, I'm not going to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. And she didn't. She sat down when the class said the Pledge of Allegiance, which is, by the way, you guys know how brave and tough that is to do. Her teacher said, go to the principal's office when she did that. And so she went, and the principal basically gave her detentions, like 3 of them, for not standing during the pledge. Chelsea's smart, though, and she's like, you can't do that to me because I didn't do anything wrong. And in fact, she contacted a human rights council in her state. It's somewhere on the East Coast, I can't remember where it is, but she contacted a human rights council in her state, and they said, yeah, you're right, they can't punish you for not standing for the pledge. They got in touch with the school district. The local news covered it, which is where this screenshot is coming from, and basically it said, Chelsea's right, the school board changed their policy to even say, if you don't want to stand for the pledge, that's perfectly fine. They had to amend their policy to do that. Kudos to Chelsea, by the way. That's amazing. I don't know if you guys saw it yesterday. BuzzFeed put up a list of, quote, like 21 things atheist girls love, unquote. So you're not going to like the article. But one of the things they actually pointed out is like Chelsea, and I think they stole the screenshot. Thanks, BuzzFeed. Chelsea is one of the people on their list because she's awesome. So I talked to Chelsea and I'm like, hey, that happened last year. How are you doing? Like, you graduated, so are things better? And this is what she told me. The worst part of this entire thing is that I was kicked out of my house the day I graduated. My father's girlfriend refused to have an atheist living with her. She thought God would set the place on fire, I guess. I was planning on living at home for most of college, but she actually told me she's working like 16-hour days because she has 2 jobs, and she's got to make ends meet living in an apartment on her own. That story never got covered by the local news or by any other news site or anything like that because, hey, they had their story. Chelsea didn't stand for the pledge. They got their story, they reported it by Chelsea. That's way more interesting and tells you a lot more about what young atheists like her are going through. But that story wasn't reported. And that's unfortunate because I think if that story got out, that would do a lot more to let people, make them aware of what we're all going through. So that's important. That story never got told. Here's another one. This was in the New York Times a couple years ago. It's a high school group from Florida, Rutherford High School. I don't know if Michael Creamer is here in the audience. I think he's here this weekend somewhere. But this story, and this is one of those stories. It's in the New York Times, but what's the story? The story is an atheist group exists. That's the whole nature of the story. And it's actually a really nice story because they talk about how this group got started, and they have dozens of people, dozens at a high school, showing up to their weekly meetings. They have like a quarter Christians showing up. A quarter of that group are Christians showing up to their meetings. They actually quoted one girl who said, yeah, I go to the SSA group one day of the week, and I go to Bible study the other day, another day of the week, and then it said like by December she stopped going to the Bible study altogether. And by the way, they actually had 2 quotations from this article that were just heartbreaking, and they were at the end. And you know, one girl didn't want her parents to know that she belonged to an atheist club. I tell my mother I'm at Ocean Club. First of all, that's not a thing. I don't know why her parents are like, yeah, that's fine, go to Ocean Club. But she has to lie to her parents about where she is. How sad is that? And another student they quoted, she asked that her name not be used for fear it would hurt her father. I don't want us to grow apart over this. Really sad, and I know a lot of you have been through that same situation. I didn't tell my parents I started an atheist group in college for a while. And by the way, it's New York Times. That's amazing that these lines got in because it really addresses the issues we got to talk about. But there were a couple stories they didn't talk about, and for lack of space for anything else. One of the stories was, how did this group even get started? Because that's an issue I know a lot of high schoolers face, just overcoming the obstacles from the administration and the faculty, finding a sponsor. How did they find a sponsor so easily? So I spoke to the sponsor, Dr. Creamer, who is going to be here, I think, this weekend. And what he told me is that he's been teaching at that school for a while, I think 30 years. So he's tenured, he has respect at the school, and he teaches a class on philosophy, and religion comes up. And so he always moderates that discussion. And sometimes kids will ask him, Dr. Creamer, what do you believe? And he's always taken the PC approach. He's like, well, it's not about what I believe. It's about what you guys believe. I don't want to sway you one way or the other. So you guys talk about what you believe. I will moderate. That's his basic stock answer. And then he realized after a while, when the kids asked their other teachers, hey, where do you go to church, Mr. or Mrs. whatever? They didn't hold back. They never said, oh, I don't want to answer that. They're like, oh, I go to this church, and you should come with me to church. Church is great. And he's like, how come they're so open about where they go to church? And here's me trying to hide everything about who I am and what I don't do on a Sunday morning. And so finally he's like, you know what, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm not going to hide that. So the next time kids said, Dr. Creamer, where do you go to church? He's like, I don't go to church. In fact, my wife and I are both atheists. And their response is like, oh. They don't care. He's like, they don't even get, why was I hiding it for this long? And a couple of those students are like, oh, he's an atheist. Let's ask him if he would be our sponsor of our atheist club. And he said yes. And that's how the group got started. It was that easy. And for all of us who have had issues trying to find a faculty sponsor, like, it was that easy. Because the teacher realized, I don't have to hide it, just like they don't have to hide it. And that story didn't get told, but that was fascinating. How many of you know who that guy is? David Barton. He's this historian who wrote a book on Thomas Jefferson last year that was so full of lies that his Christian publishers are like, there's too much lying in this one. So they're like, we're not publishing this. So I don't know why they're still publishing the Bible, but that's another story. But they took it off the shelves, his book. It was that poorly written and researched. So Glenn Beck is like, oh, I'll publish it. But David Barton wrote this book about Jefferson, and one of the things he once said, I think this is in his book, or he just said this in one of his talks. He said, you know that Supreme Court case from the 60s where they took mandatory prayer out of public school? One of the reasons they took Christian prayers out of public schools is because one of the doctors who took the stand said it was like a mental illness. It was going to cause mental disorders for children if you read the Bible in school. And that's why, can you believe they would say that about the Bible? Here's the truth. The truth is the Supreme Court did mention a doctor. Here's what the doctor said. The doctor said, if there are young Jewish kids in school and they're reading the New Testament, which isn't exactly kind to Jewish kids, it could do some long-term damage to these kids to be reading these Bible verses over and over and hear about what horrible people like they are for not accepting Jesus. And when the Supreme Court talked about this case, the only reason they brought it up is when they were giving a history of the case. You know, at a lower court, this is what happened. At the appeals court, this is what happened. The Supreme Court didn't use that to make their decision. They just mentioned it as part of the history of the case. And again, it wasn't saying the Bible is inherently something that's like going to cause you mental disorders or anything. That's taking things out of context. That's the story people reported. Like, some websites just said, can you believe David Barton said that? But again, we can do one better, because the person who brought the Bible case to the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court case was Abington v. Shemp. Hey, guess what? Shemp's an atheist. He's one of us. So I talked to Shemp. I'm like, hey, Ellery, did you hear David Barton said this about your case? What's up with that? And he gave me maybe the greatest soundbite I have ever heard. Barton rakes in millions, but has the moral compass of a cockroach. He wants us to believe he has God's direct email address. He never thought the Genesis story made any sense, and I didn't believe in talking snakes. But then Glenn Beck and David Barton came along. Amazing. And as a blogger, I just want to say that story got picked up by a lot of places because that's way more interesting than David Barton's lies. So, cool, the follow-up was so easy to do and no one else did it. And it's like, dude, when you know people lie for a living, it's so easy to call them out on their lies, and it's easy to find people who will testify to that. Here's one more. There is a group in Chicago, outside of Chicago where I'm from, that does a lot of anti-gay rhetoric, and like, it's very easy, just like David Barton, it's easy to just quote them and say, look at the crazy stuff they say, look at how weird they are and homophobic they are. But it turned out they were hosting a whole like weekend-long conference like this one, where they were going to train the next generation to be like anti-gay activists. And it's like, okay, you know exactly what they're going to say there. You know the lies they're going to tell at this conference. But instead of just going off of what they put on their website, let's follow up. Let's do one better. So I had people attend the conference. They signed up for the conference, and they didn't, like, it wasn't me, so it didn't really, like, they didn't know who these people were, so it worked out. So they attended. And it was a 3-day conference like this one. So on Friday night of the conference, I met up with the reporters that I sent there, and I'm like, so how did it go? And they were telling me stories. It was a woman and a guy, and the woman tells me, yeah, it was weird. Like, we were the only college, there were only a handful of college-age kids there, period. There was no one really young there. It was mostly older people. Basically people who are funding this sort of thing. And none of the activists they actually want to train because they can't find any who want to be trained in this stuff. But the best story is this one. The woman says to me, yeah, there was one of the few young people there was sitting next to me, and she would ask these questions of the speakers like, I have a gay friend at school. I don't know what to do. Like, how do I talk to her about her homosexuality? And the speakers would give her answers and a step-by-step list of here's what you do, here's how you handle it, here's how you fix her, right? And she asked questions all day, and during the breaks, my reporter and that girl, they chatted up, and they got along really well. And at the end of the day, that girl went up to my person, my reporter, and she's like, hey, it was really nice to meet you. I just wanted to let you know I'm not going to be here the rest of the conference. I was just here writing for a website. To which my friend's like, no way, I'm here for a website. And so is that guy over there. To which the first girl says, no way, so is that person back there. So of the few people they had attending this conference for real, someone sent me this article after the fact from The Onion. Klan rally, 70% of the country. They didn't have anyone at this conference. So the point being, like, look, you know that if no one attended this conference, undercover anyway, what would the press release have said from the conservative Christian group? It would have said, man, we had hundreds of people at this conference. That's technically true. There were young activists who wanted to learn about the next generation of homophobia, whatever. That would have also been technically true. But none of it's actually telling what the real story of what happened there. But actually going there and finding out about the stuff firsthand, that changed the way they could report about this story. And that was way more interesting than any rhetoric they could have spit out. And there's no reason any of us can't do that, because we all have anti-gay stuff or anti-anything stuff going there. And it doesn't matter if it's political. Like, go undercover and... it doesn't even have to be that stealth. Just like, go, attend, go see it firsthand. Go to church. I know a lot of your groups have done this too. Go to church for yourself and then go find out what it's like at different types of churches than the ones you might have attended. Then come back together and talk about it. Because it's way more interesting when you've actually been there and you can talk about it from firsthand experience. A lot of groups don't do this. A lot of reporters don't do it because they can't for the sake of time and money. But we can. And there's a lot bigger story going on there. And so make this a habit. So the two things, that's it. That's what you got to take away from this. Number one, fact check, including claims made by other atheists. Don't let them slide. Don't let your group get caught. Yeah, write this down. That's it. Just don't be caught saying things that you wouldn't let religious people get away with. And we should hold ourselves to higher standards. So fact check. And number two, just follow up with stories. If you read about something in the media and it really captures your attention, follow up with it. Nowadays, if I ever see a story that I find really interesting, at least interesting enough to post something about on my site, I make a note to myself if I think it's that interesting, like, hey, in a week from now, let me see how this person's doing. Let's see if the story's still around in a week, because maybe there's more to it that we don't know about. And it's just now a habit. And it's good, because I've gotten a lot more stories and interesting things to happen after the media stops paying attention. So it's fun. So, cool. Do those things. If you ever have any stories or questions, please contact me, and I'm here all weekend. So thank you all.